Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we use the most critical sources to give you the context you need to understand the big picture. Today, we're diving into a case that, well, it's one that legal scholars and philosophers have really held up as a chilling example of systemic judicial failure. We're talking about the conviction of Dr. Chen Jingwan.
That's right. And he's a PhD scholar who specializes in, of all things, physics and nonlinear complex systems.
So for you today, we've pulled together some really technical source material.
We have
What?
everything from the defendant's own very detailed appeal letter to the three core legal documents, the indictment, the verdict, and the ruling.
And we're going beyond that into some deep philosophical critiques using natural law and even the philosophy of language.
Exactly. And our mission here, just to be clear, isn't to get into the politics of it all. It is strictly to analyze the logic, or you could say the lack of logic, in the judicial process itself. We're looking at the mechanics of justice under immense strain.
Okay, so let's start with the hook, the case summary, because it's
Yeah.
really astonishing.
It is. Dr. Chen was convicted of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. It's a notoriously controversial sort of elastic crime, often called a pocket crime,
And what was it for?
for social media activity. We're talking low engagement stuff, mostly forwarding posts and adding comments on Twitter. The sources say he had fewer than 100 followers, and for that, he was sentenced to 20 months.
20 months.
What stands out to legal experts isn't just the sentence, though. It's the systematic way that the foundational rules of evidence, of intent, and of criminal causation were allegedly just set aside.
So this case is presented as a profound failure, both morally and legally.
Yes, because in response to what was essentially intellectual inquiry, the system turned against its own fundamental principles of reason.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the defense Dr. Chen put forward was, it was highly unusual. You don't see this every day.
No, you don't. This wasn't a standard legal defense. This was a physicist using complex systems theory to argue his own innocence. It's fascinating.
So he didn't just say, I didn't mean it.
Not at all. He immediately went on the attack, targeting the two essential criminal elements that you need for a pick and quarrels conviction. He argued they simply could not have been met.
And those two elements were?
First, he flatly denied that the content he forwarded was knowingly false. And second, he argued that his tiny, low-impact activity failed to cause what the law requires, which is serious disorder.
And that second point is where the science comes in, right? He used his scientific training to just negate the whole idea of causation.
Precisely. But before we get to the physics, let's just touch on his other argument about selective enforcement, because that's a huge fairness issue right from the start.
He was the only one arrested.
The only one, not the original authors, not the thousands of other people who forwarded the same content. He argued this was a textbook case of selective enforcement, which violates that basic legal principle of equal treatment. He was, in his own words, just an edge node in the network who was specifically targeted.
An edge node. Okay, that brings us right to the core of his scientific defense. How on earth did he apply network theory in a criminal case?
Well, he modeled the social media environment as a nonlinear complex system, and he cited some very advanced concepts, things like Shannon information entropy and Kolmogorov metrics.
Wait, hold on. Shannon entropy. In a courtroom, for you listening, can you put that in plain English for us?
Yeah.
What was he trying to prove with math?
He was arguing mathematically that his personal forwarding activity added such a tiny amount of information or noise to the whole system that it was basically negligible.
So his actions were too small to matter.
Not just small. He argued they were physically incapable of triggering some kind of snowball effect or systemic severe disorder. You can't legally link his single tiny action to a massive criminal consequence if the science itself proves his action was irrelevant to the system's behavior.
He was using physics to sever the required criminal causal relationship.
That's exactly it.
It's just surreal. A physicist fighting a criminal charge by quoting network theory. But he didn't stop there. He also went on to deconstruct the prosecution's main weapon, the very idea of a rumor.
Yes, and he did this philosophically. He created this incredibly airtight firewall by classifying his forwards into 4 categories and then arguing that 3 of them are completely exempt from being called a rumor because they can't be proven false.
They lack falsifiability. Let's go through those 3 because this is crucial for anyone trying to separate, discussion from crime.
Okay, the first was art or aesthetic expression. He used the example of a satirical cartoon, the Umbrella Girl. His point was that symbolic art is about interpretation, not objective fact. You can't prove a cartoon is false.
So if it can't be false, it can't be a false rumor.
Logically, no. The second category was subjective emotion, personal feelings, private comments, like his comment that Huawei will be beaten back to its original form.
That's a prediction or an opinion.
It's an internal state. It's not an objective description of reality that a court can test for truth. Your feelings can't be a rumor.
And the third.
That was rational thought or theory. Things like academic articles, theoretical analyses. He argued these are opinions for debate and scrutiny, not for a judge to rule on as true or false.
So that leaves only one category that could contain a rumor. Objective description. Things like historical documents.
Correct. But even there, he had one more legal argument. He denied that he, as an ordinary citizen, an edge node, had a legal duty to verify every single thing he forwards. He argued that duty of verification belongs to the police.
So his defense was just this multi-layered wall of logic, blending law, physics, and philosophy.
A comprehensive denial of criminal responsibility from every possible angle.
Which makes you ask, if the defense was that robust, how did the conviction even happen? And for that, we have to look at the court's own errors. Our sources call it a legal error chain.
And that chain begins with the first link, the indictment. It failed right at the foundation. The main charge that he caused serious public disorder was what scholars call a floating foundation.
Meaning, they just stated the outcome without showing their work.
Precisely. The document gives you the conclusion, but zero supporting facts.
Yeah.
No when, where, how, what scale of confusion. It was, as one critic put it, a hat without a body.
And it also just lumped everything together, right?
Yeah.
Art, opinions, facts.
Carelessly bundled it all under the single label of false information, and on top of that, it just asserted he knew it was false. It was a subjective presumption, with no actual evidence of his intent.
Okay, so that brings us to the first instance verdict, which had this huge gap to fill. They had to prove his intent. And this is where things get, well, frankly, pretty disturbing.
This is where they introduce the high education guilt theory.
The what?
It's maybe the single most egregious legal step in the whole process. To make up for the lack of evidence on intent, the court literally claimed that because Dr. Chen has a doctorate-level high education, he should possess a high level of cognition,
Okay.
thus possessing the deliberate intent to allow harmful results to occur.
Wow. So, because you're smart, you must be guilty. That's the logic. What is the danger of a theory like that? Can the state just penalize intellectual curiosity itself?
That is the absolute danger. It's been denounced as an identity-based presumption of guilt. It violates the presumption of innocence by illegally equating a person's cognitive ability, their status, with a specific criminal intent.
Critics call it anti-intellectual jurisprudence.
Because it penalizes intellect rather than proving a criminal act, it suggests that if you're highly educated, you actually have a lower bar for being found guilty, which completely upends the principle of legal equality.
A staggering flaw. So let's move to the last link in the chain. The second instance ruling, the appeal. This was his last chance.
And the door was slammed shut. The appellate court, first of all, abandoned its duty by ruling without an open hearing, and then it just completely failed to address any of his core defense points. The science, the philosophy, the selective enforcement, all ignored.
But the biggest violation, the one that really strikes at the heart of criminal justice, was the reversal of the burden of proof.
Absolutely. The ruling stated that the appellant, Dr. Chen, who was in detention, had failed to submit new evidence to prove his appeal.
Wait, he had to prove his own innocence.
Let's be very clear for everyone listening. In criminal law, the burden of proof is always 100% on the prosecution. By demanding a detained defendant provide new evidence, the court illegally and absurdly shifted that entire burden. It's a fundamental breakdown of procedure.
This sounds like a total structural collapse. So if the law failed this badly on a procedural level, what about on a moral level? When does a law stop being a law?
To answer that, we have to turn to the philosophy of natural law, and specifically to John Finnis's work. Finnis argues that a law's legitimacy, its authority, comes from promoting what he calls basic human goods and acting with practical reasonableness.
And the famous saying is lex injusta non est lex. An unjust law is not truly a law.
Exactly. So Finnis gives us a moral test. Does this legal action help people pursue things that are inherently good? And in Dr. Chen's case, the process failed that test systematically.
How so? Which basic goods were violated?
The most obvious one was the good of knowledge. Finnis is very clear that any institutional suppression of the pursuit of truth, which includes inquiry, forwarding information, discussing ideas, is a fundamental attack on natural law. By criminalizing an academic's intellectual activity, the system was attacking the basic human good of seeking truth.
So punishing someone for sharing information is an institutional assault on a core human good. What about the second one? Practical reasonableness?
Right. Practical reasonableness just means the state, the court, has to act rationally and non-arbitrarily. But they used his identity, high education, for an arbitrary prosecution. The prosecutor allegedly refused to even verify the evidence. That is, by definition, the state acting unreasonably.
And what does this do to the idea of the common good? Isn't that what law is for?
Well, the law's highest purpose is the common good, creating conditions for everyone in society to flourish. But in this case, our sources argue the common good was twisted to mean just order stability, maintained by suppressing thought. When order trumps truth and reason, Finnis would say the law is serving a pseudo-good. It's serving itself, not the people.
A damning moral critique. But the failure also seems to be about the words themselves. Let's get to our final philosophical deep dive, the critique from the philosophy of language.
This is fascinating because it's about the struggle to control meaning itself. We can look at this through the lens of, say, Wittgenstein and his idea of language games.
The idea that a word's meaning depends on the context, the rules of the game it's being used in.
Yeah, exactly. And here we have two games colliding. Dr. Chen was playing the language game of academic inquiry. The rules are suspicion, analysis, pluralism. The court violently forced his words into the language game of state stability, where the rules are authority, obedience, and the elimination of dissent.
And that forcing completely distorts the meaning of his words.
Profoundly.
Yeah.
Which leads to the next idea from speech act theory. A verdict isn't just describing a crime, it's a performative utterance. It is performing the action of punishment.
The words themselves are an act of coercion.
That's it. The court's act of labeling his behavior a crime is described as a violent performative utterance. It uses language to literally manufacture a criminal identity where facts and reason couldn't prove one existed.
And finally, this brings us to the charge itself, picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
And this is where a philosopher like Foucault would say the power is most visible. Picking quarrels is criticized as an empty signifier. It's a term so vague it can mean anything.
It's a blank check.
A blank check. And judicial power exploits that ambiguity. It violently anchors that empty term onto Dr. Chen's complex intellectual behavior. By doing that, the system monopolizes the right to define disturbance and shuts down any shared, rational, public understanding of what's allowed.
That's an incredibly powerful synthesis. If we pull all three levels together, the scientific defense, the legal failure, and the moral and philosophical flaws, what are the final takeaways for you, the listener?
I think the case of Dr. Chen Jingwen is a textbook, almost tragic, illustration of the disconnect between formal legality and substantive justice. The documents exist, the procedure happened, but the moral core of law, the need for evidence, reason, fairness, it was just systematically abandoned.
It reveals the precise tools that can be used to criminalize intellectual inquiry. You collapse the boundary between facts and opinions, you penalize education, and you illegally flip the burden of proof.
And it becomes clear that the real harm wasn't caused by a few low engagement tweets. The harm was the systemic, arbitrary response to intellectual freedom.
Which leaves a really important question for you to think about.
It does. If the ultimate meaning of law isn't to serve coercive power, but to respect reason and the common good, as Finnis suggests, then how resilient is any society whose legal system punishes the very pursuit of knowledge? If law loses its commitment to reason, it loses its moral authority, it stops being a guarantor of justice and becomes merely a tool of stability,